people ask why I write, because the news is usually bad, so you write your own stories. The first story I'm going to read is just to set the scene. You're in a death row prison. You're on death row in a jail cell with a prisoner who's about to be executed, and it's a pretty intense story. It gets pretty intense, so just have an open mind, enjoy it, maybe close your eyes. And the story is called No, Padre. No, Padre. No, Padre, you can get the hell out of my cell is what you can do. Where does your belief in afterlife come from anyway? My grandfather used to say that the only reason that humans believe in an afterlife is because of the fear that quickly follows the realization that we will eventually die. Once early man evolved enough to have a fear of death, it was easy for the most unscrupulous types, the descendants of whom are modern-day politicians and clergy, to play on that fear to control entire civilizations. It is all quite clear to me, Padre. Why are there no dolphin churches? Quick, name me the elephant high holy days. Why is it that we never see chimpanzees praying the rosary or going to a chimpanzee confessional? Why aren't there poodles making annual pilgrimages to Mecca? It is simple. We are only the only animals on the planet with the curse of knowing that we are mortal. That realization of mortality and its directly related fear is the basis of the largest hoax ever perpetuated on the human race. Jeff Plinkin, or death row inmate 2897494, had just finished a meal, his last one. After his quick dismissal of Padre Raphael, he sat there looking at the temporary table in front of him. It was covered with empty plates that had been filled with the food his mother had made him for that last meal. There had been stew and biscuits and ragut pie with sausage. She also made him a chicken breast sandwich swimming in mayonnaise and an ice-cold can of soda wrapped in aluminum foil, just like she used to pack in his lunch when he was a boy. Mom knew that foil would keep her boy's soda cold all the way through lunchtime. He picked up the paper bags that his last meal had been packed in and smelled each one, and came upon one that smelled like home. He put that bag over his head and he lay down. Besides cooking his favorite meals, filling one of those bags with the smells of home was the last loving gesture that his mother gave him. They hadn't spoken in many years as he had been in solitary confinement. He breathed in very slowly and could smell his mother's perfume, the same that she had worn since he was a boy. This brought him back to waking from nightmares in his youth and how his mother would come to him and embrace him tightly and sit on the edge of his bed until he was soundly sleeping again. In his mind's eye, he could feel his nose pressed against her neck and smell that wonderful perfume coming from her skin. He could smell the detergent that his mother used as well as many other smells that combine in any home to make that home's unique nasal signature. His childhood home smells brought him to the most peaceful place. Although he was still lying alone in his cell, for his last few moments alive, he was transported to the loving embrace of his mother and the caring home that she had made for him. He felt no fear, as he believed his execution would simply bring the most peaceful sleep he had ever experienced. In modern times, they make execution painless. He knew that the victims' families would get some satisfaction that he was no longer living, but as their loved ones had died in the most painful agony, he knew that such a peaceful and humane end would be a lasting emotional cancer for the rest of their lives. He knew that the victims' family members would be in the execution room, sitting behind the one-way mirror, alongside the reporters. He had vowed to remain humble and to not make eye contact and to not utter a sound. He didn't want to embarrass his mother by making a scene in front of all of those people. This was to be his one less loving gesture to her. He heard his cell block door unlock and slide open. He heard the shuffle of many feet coming to collect him. Before his last meal, they had forced him to put on an adult diaper, as most of those put to death will evacuate well before their hearts have stopped beating. He was standing in his cell when the death posse arrived. He had requested that the Padre not be present while he was a dead man walking, and that his mother cremate his body as soon as it was returned to her. Long before he committed his misdeeds, he had made peace with the fact that he would eventually lose his life because of them. His devout atheism left him the perfect killer, unrestricted by the fear of the damnation of his non-existent soul. The thought that anyone believed in anything other than the randomness and fatelessness of our existences made him giggle. As he stepped over the threshold of the execution room, the warden said the obligatory, "May God have mercy on your soul." The door closed behind him, and he stood before the cross-shaped execution table facing the one-way mirror. He calmly extended his arms in a perfect crucifixion pose, and within 60 seconds he was fully secured to it with the intravenous lines placed neatly in his left arm. A remote button was pushed and the table began its descent backwards, and soon he was staring at the bright fluorescent lights above him. He heard the sound of air pressure and realized that the first chemical in the executioner's cocktail was now flowing through his veins. He smiled, and his thoughts turned to another thing his grandfather had told him. He had said, "Jeffrey, don't fear death. Death is the end of all misery and toil." The world is a brutal place, and the people within it even more so. With death comes a true final peace that can't be found here. His mind began to swim, and his vision faded. A physical numbing began to cover his body, and he felt assured that there would be no pain with this physical ending. He was feeling the peace that his grandfather told him about so long ago. There was nothing but blackness now, the truest and most real blackness he had ever seen or felt. He knew the end was near, and he gave himself to it gladly. He heard the sound of a heart monitor flatline. The last remnants of his human self realized that he would soon be dead, and then his brain and body, a moment later, were in fact dead. Suddenly, he heard or more felt a cackling from what seemed to be a great distance beneath him. It wasn't the cackling of a cartoon Halloween witch or a shriek of animated ghosts from the Saturday morning cartoons he watched when he was a boy. It was an all-knowing cackling. It was deep, inhuman, and it was getting closer. He heard the gnashing of teeth. He tried to thrash his limbs to escape, and he tried to scream for help, but he was unable, for he no longer existed in physical form. He felt the scalding wet breath enveloping him, but not physically. No, it wasn't a simple breath at all, but more like an adrenaline-filled, terrified exhalation of 1,000 water buffaloes at full gallop across the African plain as they fruitlessly run from the cheetahs who are gaining on them. It was the breath of the full negation of hope. It was the breath of eternal damnation. He was helplessly afloat in the ether now, in his pure emotional state. He was devoid of physical form and completely enveloped in the blackness, the death breath fiercely scalding him, and the cackling directly beneath him. The devil opened his fingers and extended his razor-sharp claws. In one motion, they were plunged deep inside Jeff Plinken's essence. The devil's claws enveloped the soul of Jeff Plinken for a moment and held it still and calm, just as a mother cradles her newborn child. Then the devil, in one well-practiced motion, savagely removed it. He held it against his bosom with both hands and started his slow descent with it back into hell, cackling all the while. The end. Not many Hallmark cards that we made from that story. They keep asking me, but I keep coming up with them. The cackling all the while always ruins the contract. Well, thank you for that. This next story is about, some people read it as a story of loneliness, but it's really a story of aloneness and isolation and having conviction on a path you're on, which sometimes can leave you isolated. And sometimes you're confused, sometimes you don't know, where to go and what to do, but you have no choice for some reason to be pushed ahead, and sometimes there is no path in front of you. So it's called The Sandstorm in the Desert. He spent 2 days at the way station. This was a single room made of corrugated metal, but there was shade there, and he enjoyed it as long as he could. He usually had no shade. He now stood outside this metal-enclosed room. The sun, which never set, hung perfectly above his head and cast only a minimal shadow directly beneath him. He had long since left any beaten path behind. His instincts were driving the direction in which he would be moving. The barren desert spread out before him like a universe of heat. He was only in the direct sunlight for a few moments, and tiny rivulets of sweat were running together at the base of his chin, forming a bead of sweat, one of the million that his body would create this day, as it had every day since he was born. He was completely naked now, his skin long since accustomed to the sun's radiant whipping. His skin was leather-like. It had turned from a pristine white to the darkest brown years ago. The only way that it could turn any darker was if it was set afire. He stood with his hands on his hips and looked east, his light eyes straining with pain from the reflected sun. The heat coming up from the ground created a fog-like impression, although he knew there was no moisture contained within this optical illusion. He stood alone and breathed deeply. He wondered what it would be like to see another human being on this plane. He wondered what they would look like. He wondered what their voice would sound like. He stood alone and looked east. He saw nothing but his loneliness awaiting him. His loneliness, his constant companion, was beckoning him on. The only thing that kept him moving was an unknown force exerting pressure on his soul. He took the first of the thousands of steps he would take that day. He continued creating this path, his path. He turned briefly to take one last look at the way station, but it was not discernible any longer behind the wall of windblown sand that had suddenly erupted from the ashen desert floor. He walked blindly within the sandstorm with his eyes closed. He didn't need his eyes to maintain his sense of direction. Grains of sand pelted his body, and they felt like molten pins being driven deep within the few points of tender skin he had remaining. He continued on, knowing that each step could be his last, but also knowing that he could not stop. He became exhausted and started to hallucinate. As the day-long storm raged around him, he was shown a vision. He was shown that he would not simply die when his end finally came. He was shown his body levitating above the sand, being pulled into a cyclone of sand and wind. In an instant, his body and soul were pulverized into 1,000,000 grains of sand, becoming one with the desert. He existed nowhere, yet he existed everywhere at the same moment. His eyes opened for the first time that day. The desert was still. The sun had returned. He stood facing east, wide-eyed, and shaking as a man shakes when he is told that his first child was stillborn. In one of his greatest moments of clarity, he understood upon that which he was treading. He suddenly realized that the grains of sand swirling around him in the windstorm were the pulverized souls of all the others who had come before him, but who were unable to fill their destiny. He was continuing their journey, the trek that they could not finish, the crusade they had left unfulfilled. He was walking on countless numbers of pulverized souls. One day he would be one of them, swirling lifeless in a sea of heat, never truly being able to rest. Even in death, the sun will beat on him and it will never set. He will become a part of the sandstorms. Parts of him will pierce the skin of others on their journeys. As within his own skin, parts of him will become embedded in the skin of others. As within his own eyes, parts of him will become embedded within the eyes of others. He continued walking, and with each new footfall, his understanding grew. And I can't write poetry. I can't. Well, people ask me to, but roses are red, violets are blue, as it always comes out. This last story is a very nice story, so I'll end with something nice. So push the nightmares to the side, maybe. Gnashing of teeth and all that gets a little rough, right? This story, some of my things, it came to me in a vision. I had this vision of a little girl who, I'm not remarried or anything, but it became my stepdaughter. I had this vision of this little girl sitting in front of me on a little ottoman, and I was sitting there sort of like an enclosed porch, and she was just with her hands on my knees, like as if we're going to play patty cake. And that she just came to me one morning when I woke up. And she was just there. And as with a lot of my stories, a lot of people know me here, it just sort of sits here, and I see her all day, and I do everything else and talk to you people, and there's stuff happening right now with stories that you don't even want to know. So this story just very sweet, and it just suddenly, as it grew and grew and grew, finally with my stories, finally comes out. My process is, it just sort of, it comes out. I don't really go back and change it. I don't edit it on storyboard. It just comes out much faster than even read it to you in one sort of. I edit for grammar because I do miss a few commas when I'm in that rush. So this is called I Need to Talk to You, or the Christmas List. She grabbed his hand and said, I need to talk to you. She turned away from him, still maintaining as firm a grip as a 9-year-old girl could muster, and pulled him towards the spot which she had chosen to have her little talk. He got it from the kitchen table, his tie still undone around his neck, and left a fresh bowl of frosted flakes into which he had just poured close to freezing milk, waiting to be eaten. He knew they would be soggy by the time he returned, but he knew his stepdaughter now as well as he knew his own beautiful daughters, and he could tell by the look on her face that this conversation could not wait, soggy frosted flakes or not. Still holding his left hand in her right, she opened the inside front door with her left and stood aside and allowed him to walk past her onto the enclosed porch. She quickly followed and closed the door behind her. She led him to their wicker love seat, and he sat. She pulled the wicker ottoman, as the wicker chair and sofa were much too heavy, directly up to his knees, and she plopped herself down and placed her hands on them. He thought for a moment that they were going to play patty cake, which had become one of their favorite things to do together. His mind brought him back to the first day he had met his stepdaughter. He had been dating her mother for almost 6 months, and he had known from the first meeting that he wanted to spend the rest of his life taking care of her and her daughter. He was going to come over for dinner, as her mother thought this would be comfortable for everyone. Her mother had told her so many things about this wonderful man for the past half year. He arrived, and his bride-to-be met him at the door. Her daughter was upstairs in her room. They gave her the space which she seemed to need, and they both sat down at the dinner table. She was called down, and down she came. holding an 8x10 photo of her biological father against her chest. She sat down at the dinner table, her left arm embracing and pressing the picture against her. She ate dinner that way. No one mentioned it, and he conversed with her without showing a worry or fear. Upon finishing her last piece of macaroni, she asked if she could be excused, and she was given permission to leave the table. Up to her room she went, and they knew when she had gotten there by the slamming of her door against its jamb. That was over a year ago, and he was very proud at how hard he had worked to respect this beautiful little girl, but also to give her the love that she so desperately needed from a man. His mind brought him back to the present, where her tiny hands were on his knees, and she was simply staring at him. He let her collect her thoughts. She leaned towards him, and he subconsciously did the same. She whispered, "I decided what I want for Christmas." A great sense of relief came over him. So many worries and concerns were racing around his head as she sat silent in front of him for those few moments on their enclosed porch. He had seen her going through every online store the past few days and printing out her favorite choices. This was going to be easy. Maybe those frosted flakes could be saved after all. She bowed her head for a moment and closed her eyes. She slowly inhaled and slowly exhaled, and then picked up her head and stared directly into his eyes, her gaze never wavering, and she said the following: "There's only one thing I want for Christmas, and only one thing on my Christmas list is the only thing that I want." "Shoot," he said, "and I promise me and your mom will do our best." She whispered, "I want to call you Daddy from now on, just like your daughters do. I want to be your daughter too. Please think about it." His mind and body, which had become limp and relaxed a few moments ago, felt as if it was thrust against the wall. He was suddenly completely present and more focused than he had ever been. His mouth instantly went dry, and his mind ignored all the other stimuli as if they had been placed in a warm, quiet cocoon. He knew from his broken childhood what these types of moments meant to such a young person. Their eyes and hands locked. She continued, "I know you don't have to, and I know that I'm not your real daughter, but you make me feel like I am. When you tuck us in at night, I never feel like I'm different. When I call you because I'm scared or need a drink of water, you always come in for me, just like when they call you. When you call home at night because you're going to be late to say goodnight, you always make sure you speak to me to tell me you love me and miss me too. You really love me just like you love them. It is like you were supposed to be my daddy, so please give me you for Christmas." Her mother's tears were flowing uncontrollably, and she was doing her best to be silent about it. She had no idea that her daughter had wanted to speak to her husband, let alone what she might have had on her mind. As soon as she had heard the inside front door close, she ran into the living room and sat on the inside couch, which was directly under an open window, with only a simple lace curtain shielding her from view. His eyes were full, and his heart was full as well. This little girl had given him so much joy since he had met her. He never believed that his feelings for a stepchild could in any way match those of his own children, and she had shown him how wrong he had been. The first of many tears he would cry that day fell on his cheek, and he grabbed her hands, and with a hoarse voice, the almost crying half, he said, "I would love to be your daddy, and will be for as long as you want me to." In an instant she was in his arms, with her head buried in his neck. He could feel her tiny tears racing down his back. As crying children so often do, she began to slightly shake, and her speech became staccato, and she said over and over again through her joy-filled tears and sniffles, "I love you, Daddy, I love you, Daddy," until she lost her breath and had to rest. For as long as she could remember, she wanted a daddy to love her and to love. It was her first conscious hope upon realizing her biological daddy would not be coming back so long ago. Her mother, his wife, came to join them, and all three sat on their wicker love seat and cried with the greatest joy and love in their hearts. Her daddy simply held both of them with his strong arms wrapped around both of them and rocked all three of them for what was a long time. He finally understood what being a husband and father really meant, and he stayed that little girl's daddy and that beautiful woman's husband until the day he died. Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.